Thank you so much for having me and for being here. It is truly an honor, a treat, and a privilege, and also the opportunity to leave America for the week, so thank you, thank you. I mean, yeah. So I want to give a little context and background behind this talk. Last year, I delivered a talk called basically talking about the role of shame in UX research. And what I wasn't prepared for was the amount of people that would reach out to me afterwards with their stories of shame and trauma and just difficulties. And usually, the types of questions that were coming my way kind of fell into one of two buckets. One, how do I deal with, process, and handle difficult things that have happened outside of the work while I'm at work? And two, how do I manage, deal with, and process all those things that are happening in the work that are also painful and difficult? And it reminded me of a story. Some of you may have already heard me tell this story, so bear with me. I promise it is related to what we're about to talk about. But in the early 1900s, some psychiatric hospitals had a strange and peculiar way of determining whether someone was sane enough to re-enter society. They would lead the patient to a room where there was a sink, to which they would plug the sink, turn on the water, and wait for the water to overflow and hit the floor, only to then hand the patient a mop, and then they would leave and see what would happen. If the patient started to take the plug out, turn off the sink, and mop up the water, they were deemed as ready to re-enter society. But if the patient started to frantically mop, they were deemed as needing more time because they had failed to identify the root of the problem. Some of you in this room today are frantically mopping. You are going to work and leaving feeling drained and full of less life. You are toying between this tension of burnout and boredom. You are dreading to have that question asked to you, how's work going? You have that project, that interview, where you leave it and you just feel tired, depleted. You are struggling with depression and anxiety. If you are underrepresented in this industry, especially people who are Black, Latinx, Indigenous, LGBTQ, you are tired of the hypocrisy that you keep hearing from leaders, from companies on what does it really mean to be human-centered, all the while not acknowledging things like privilege and injustice. And so many of you have been, are currently, or might enter a season of frantically mopping because you have failed to identify the problem. And so today, I'm not going to be handing you a mop. Today, I would like to address that plug, and I would like to challenge this notion. Because contrary to the move fast and break things mentality about our industry, today is going to be about slowing down, taking an opportunity to mend ourselves, our industry, and the perception of our profession. And we're going to do that today by addressing 3 mindset shifts in thinking, from how things might currently be thought of to frameworks that bring a little more dimension to addressing the role of self-neglect within our industry, but more importantly, the role that it plays in the lives of each and every one of you in this room. So I have 3 mindset shifts to share with you today. 3 mindset shifts, and then I'm out of your way. Now, traditionally, the UX research professional has aligned and identified themselves as part of the product and tech industry, in part because, well, the UX founding fathers told us to, or because we find ourselves in roles in companies that fall under this umbrella. But when I look at the UX thought leaders and some of their more recent conversations, ideas, content, I can't help but notice what seems to feel like a little bit of confusion. And there's a lot of examples. Some of you have probably run into this while you've been on Twitter, and it just triggered you and ruined your whole day. So I'll just surface one. Don Norman wrote this article about a couple months ago, Why I Don't Believe in Empathic Design. And he goes on to say that it sounds wonderful, but the search for empathy is simply misled. The type of design that I've been advocating for years, the human-centered design process, means that we actually must go out and understand what the real issues are and what people's real needs are in order to design something. So we send out anthropologists or design researchers and the designers, then try to figure out appropriate solutions constrained by the technology that's possible, the cost, time frame, etc. Eventually, we build something and go through a series of iterations to make sure it really works for the population we care about. What's happening? Let's go back a few slides. So he says, the type of design that I've been advocating for, the human-centered design process, means that we actually must go out and understand what the real issues are and what people's real needs are in order to design something. I don't know about you, but this sounds a lot like empathic design. The very thing that I guess he does not believe in. And so what's happening here? And more importantly, how much longer are we going to debate the same shit? Only to reinforce orthodoxies that lead to, at best, the constant repackaging of ideas for the purpose of blogs, articles, and books, and at worst, a prideful competition for relevance. Better yet, if we can't figure out what it means to be empathic and human-centered towards the people our work impacts, how can we be empathic and human-centered toward ourselves? Essentially, this question right here challenges one of the very core orthodoxies in our industry, which is that we are a part of the product and tech industry. But what if we identified less with the product and tech industry and more with the human service industry? What if we saw ourselves less as product and tech professionals and more as human service professionals? Individuals who uniquely approach the objective of meeting human needs through an interdisciplinary knowledge base focusing on prevention as well as remediation of problems and maintaining a commitment to improving the overall quality of life of people. Examples of this are public administrators, social workers, counselors, therapists, and the like, but this also sounds a lot like us, right? And many of us feel like it's our responsibility within our companies to advocate for, to champion the needs and the experiences of the users that will be interacting with the products that we help design. One of the most immediate benefits of thinking more of ourselves as human service professionals is I believe it would eliminate that debate of, I don't want to say user, we're people. We should say human beings. Because when you look at the human service industry, they understand that fundamentally at the core of what they do is to advocate for and champion other people, so they're not having these frivolous debates about, should we say clients or people or human beings? Because they understand the very core nature of what they do and the responsibilities that come with that. And so within that, similar to human service professionals, whether we are aware of it or not, we work the most closely to the complexity, the beauty, and the difficulties of what it means to be human. And the human service industry can help us understand the work that we do and the impact it can have on the UX research professional. So let's start here. When we think about what it means to be the UX researcher, we often gravitate towards the upside of things. People are often quick to say, well, I love working with people, I love to get to collaborate, I love just talking. But I want you to pause and ask yourself, What are the personal risks that come with being a UX researcher? What personal risks were you warned about with this profession, if at all? What have you heard from leaders in our industry, if anything, about this? And what mental and emotional tolls were you warned about when it came to being a UX researcher from your professors, your coworkers, your colleagues, and the like? I was recently talking to a researcher who had just wrapped up this project where she was working with financial planners. And she was processing with me a little bit about some of the things that she was grappling with and experiencing. She talked about how she felt overwhelmed by unexpected stories that came up in the interview process. Stories about foreclosures, stories about families being broken apart, things that she did not emotionally prepare herself to handle. She talked about how after one particular interview, she felt completely drained and like she wanted to completely stop. And after me and her were talking a little bit more about it, she realized that the tone and the way that her participant was talking reminded her of some of the condescending way that her dad talked to her and her siblings growing up about money. And after the interview, she just felt done. She talked about how she had a hard time ramping up for the next project. Her and her team had 2, 3, 4, 5 celebrations. Yay, we did this. And her manager started to confuse what she thought was boredom for really a desire for closure, because she had spent so much time with these stakeholders and with these participants and hearing these stories, and part of her role was to deeply care about the people she was working with. She felt like stakeholders couldn't and would not extend empathy. No matter how many stories she surfaced, how many amazing quotes she was able to pull up, she felt like there was a disconnect from the people who could actually impact the product and make people's lives better. How many of you have ever felt these things? I know that this is a space where, technically we should all be comfortable being a little bit vulnerable and transparent with each other, but just by a show of hands, how many of you have either experienced some of these things or know someone who has? That's pretty much everyone. And so here's this radical idea, because what's kind of hard is, as researchers, we're supposed to be neutral, right? So what space are we creating to have these conversations? But here's a more radical idea. We are beings that experience emotion. Emotion is just a part of who we are. There's not an on and off switch to that. And so it's more about learning to recognize it, learning how to sit with them and address them. I'll give you a little insight into my self-care regimen. So at the beginning of every year, I always commit the first 2 months to therapy. I kind of view it like an annual physical, except a checkup for my mind and my spirit. And this year, I wanted to make sure that my therapist was, one, a Black woman, because I did not feel like explaining all the intricacies of what does it mean to be Black in the workplace and in America, et cetera, et cetera. I was like, this is expensive, so I want to use every minute accordingly, and I don't want to waste time ramping you up to speed on my life. And the second is, because I have a background in counseling and human services, I wanted to make sure I had a therapist who was used to counseling therapists, because I was like, look, your bullshit radar needs to be on a whole nother level with me. Because I know how to give the illusion of depth. I was like, so I need you to be able to just cut through that and help me get to the point. And I remember we were having one session where she looked at me and she was like, Vivianne, you need to learn how to just sit and feel. It's like the good, the bad. You just have to learn how to sit and feel these emotions and still just be. And I was like, Cool. So, how long is that gonna take? Because I got shit to do. And obviously, it doesn't work like that. But I say that to say that this is hard stuff. It's stuff that I think it's safe to say that most of our parents were like, hey, let's talk about your emotions, how to process it. And they were consistent with that throughout your whole life. I super doubt that unless your parent is like freaking Brene Brown. And so it's not about ignoring your emotions at work. It's about learning to recognize them and what to do about them. Behind me, what you see is an emotion wheel. You can Google this. There's various forms that this takes place. But what I want us to start thinking about is what happens when your work or your participants make you feel insecure. Something that they say. What happens when they make you feel insecure? Or how about exasperated? Shocked. I hear stories a lot about people who are in interviews and their participant just shares something completely out of left field that they just were not prepared for. Or what about hurt? Have you ever been hurt by something that's happened at work or something your participant said? Or even frustrated. And really under frustration is anger. And so how do you recognize these? Because up here, there's a lot of emotions here. And I love this because it gives just more language to a vocabulary that many of us did not grow up learning about or hearing about. And unfortunately, far too many of us, the following rings true. Over time, many UX researchers become desensitized to human emotion and experience an acute overdose of feeling. They learn to keep boundaries firmly in place and turn off their emotions. Even when we maintain such a guarded and cautious stance, there are times when contact with our participants penetrates us deeply, sometimes in ways we neither acknowledge nor understand. What's interesting about this quote is although it would seem like it's talking about UX researchers and their participants, this quote actually comes from a book on being a therapist, and it's talking about this experience that practitioners and clients experience. And I couldn't help but read this quote and think about us and the way we talk about human connection, the way we talk about how do you process emotion. And so this quote brings me to a second shift in thinking for the UX researcher. From self-care is ideal to self-care as an ethical imperative. And by ethical imperative, I mean a principle or practice required to avoid doing harm unto others. It still fascinates me. Now, keep in mind, I come from a counseling human service background. I made a career switch into UX research. But it still fascinates me how ethics is like a buzz in our industry. As if we're just realizing that things that interact with people affect people? I remember when I made my switch into this industry, just being like, wow, y'all don't really teach about ethics, talk about ethics. Can I see your curriculum? Oh, it's not really in there? Okay. And given that we work so closely with people, it amazes me that this is still kind of like a buzz thing. If you could just entertain me for a second, I'll give you my theory as to why. When you look at the UX founding fathers and a splash of white women and Julie from Facebook, you have this foundation and this history where privilege is king. And now that we're farther along into this field, now that you have more voices of color, more people who are coming from the LGBTQ community and other backgrounds are willing to say, hey, we should reflect the diversity of experiences we're designing for, so why, when we think about UX leaders, is that not representative of this thing that we supposedly value so much, which is diversity of experience and being human? I ask people, hey, think about who the UX thought leaders are today. And then pause and ask yourself, how many of them are Black? How many of them are trans? How many of them are able-bodied? And I truly believe within the UX field that the UX research field should be the most diverse and inclusive out of all the parts of the UX industry. But the conversation needs to shift a little bit, because I feel like when we talk about ethics, we often talk about and address more the relationship that the UX professionals have with the rest of the world. But really, we need to start talking about and addressing the relationship a UX professional has with themselves. This is just one of many examples of a professional organization meant to support human service professionals. This is the American Counseling Association. They support licensed professionals, students, and the like. And they are based in the States. And again, a lot of organizations not only have these groups, but these groups also have a code of ethics. With the ACA, the most recent rendition was done in about 2014. And their code of ethics was built on and operates out of this understanding. Professional values are an important way of living out an ethical commitment. I don't know if you've asked yourself that lately, but what are your professional values? What do you see being demonstrated and modeled for you by people in your organizations, thought leaders, and even conference speakers? But what are your professional values? I also think this is a really good interview question if you're trying to figure out if a team's toxic or not. Just ask them, hey, how would you describe, what do you think your manager would say if you asked them, what are your professional values? You learn a lot from that question. And so they crafted this code of ethics, and here's what we can learn from the human service professional, especially those who are counselors and therapists. They can't see their job possible apart from having a self-care regimen. They can't do it because they recognize how closely they work with people. And so within their code of ethics, they have something called professional responsibility. They have a lot of language that goes in to describe that, but then they also include this gem in here. In addition, counselors engage in self-care activities to maintain and promote their own emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual well-being to best meet their professional responsibilities. I love this. This is a holistic view of self-care. And I'm sure we're all kind of familiar with emotional self-care. You've heard some TED Talk about it, mental health care. But why would a professional organization include spiritual well-being in this? Again, professional organization includes spiritual. And I find that this is where Brené Brown's definition, scholar in all things compassion, vulnerability, et cetera, this is where I find her definition to be incredibly helpful. She says, practicing spirituality brings a sense of perspective, meaning, and purpose to our lives. To some people, this is placing your faith in however you see your higher power. For some people, this is gardening. This is going on a hike, going on a walk. This is volunteering. But really, it's things and practices that ground yourself in perspective, meaning, and purpose. Maintaining and promoting this holistic view and understanding of well-being and self-care is considered to be a professional responsibility to the human service professional. And the reason why it's included is because it starts to lay the groundwork for talking about some of the risks that come when you're working in a profession where you work so closely with people. So they have a section called impairment. This document is like mad long. Google it, you can find it. But it says, counselors monitor themselves for signs of impairment from their own physical, mental, or emotional problems and refrain from offering or providing professional services when impaired. They seek assistance for problems that reach the level of professional impairment. And if necessary, they limit, suspend, or terminate their professional responsibilities until it is determined that they may safely resume their work. Simply put, they recognize that if they answer the siren call of self-neglect, they will and could potentially harm the people that they work with because, again, they recognize how closely their work impacts people and their lives. And I know, like, sometimes when we read stuff like this, we're like, wait, what? Limit, suspend, terminate? I have projects to do, I have deadlines to make, and my stakeholder does not give a damn about my well-being. But I think we can start to challenge that orthodoxy. I think we can start to help our organizations have a better understanding of what we do and how we should operate within our different organizations and companies. So the question is, can you recognize the signs of professional impairment from your own physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual problems? Do you know how to be vulnerable and humble, keyword, enough to seek help when you start experiencing them? This is not easy stuff. And again, when you think about the human service professional, they understand this because it's been drilled to them in school. Their leaders and conferences are always talking about this and reiterating this. But more importantly, they're professionally held accountable to live this out and to prioritize this in their life because of what they do. So let's flesh out a little bit. What does it look like to demonstrate a sign of professional impairment? And where do they stem from? So essentially, we need to talk about compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. Now, compassion fatigue is the profound emotional and physical erosion that takes place when helpers are unable to refuel and regenerate. Examples of symptoms. But really, what's important to understand is that compassion fatigue is common and is always at some point experienced by people where a part of what they do requires them to extend empathy. There's no silver bullet to dodge compassion fatigue. It's something you will always experience as a human service professional. It's about learning what does that look like in my role and how do I address it. So I'm going to just throw a couple real-life examples from talking to people, interviewing the people about how can this play out in our work and how can it be potentially harmful. So let's just look at anger and irritability. You lose patience with a participant in a study and say something potentially shaming or condescending, and you keep abruptly cutting them off to keep them on track. Here's the thing. We don't know a lot about the backgrounds of our participants. I heard a story about a well-meaning researcher was trying to keep this participant on track and kept trying to redirect them, finding a moment where the participant breathed so they could ask a new question. And the participant started to get flustered. And at one point just started crying. So the researcher pauses, asks what's wrong, and the participant just starts pouring out about how it's so frustrating that the researcher kept cutting her off. Researcher, instead of just listening, tries to defend themselves, explaining, well, you're brought in for this purpose, you signed the NDA, blah, blah, blah. And in a moment of vulnerability, the participant shares, how growing up, their parents never listened to them. And when they would share, would cut them off, and she was just leaving an ex-husband who would do the same thing, and it made her feel like she wasn't being heard or seen or valued. And so, unintentionally, the researcher caused harm to this participant. I'll give you another example. Difficulty concentrating. You're having difficulty focusing and finding supporting quotes in your interview transcripts, so you loosely make some quotes up to support one of your key insights. Shockingly, I've heard this a lot, which is terrifying. And if we had a board and a court of ethics, I'd be reporting their ass. But putting my empathy hat on, I understand that we have deadlines, we have goals that our companies want us to meet. But I remember talking to my mentor, and he was talking about how, he has this saying that goes something along the lines of, while your company's name may be on my check, I don't work for you. I work for the people that will be experiencing you and the products that you create. And I love that. Of Google may be on your paycheck, the government may be on your paycheck, but technically we don't work for them, we work for people. And that's powerful and liberating in so many ways. Let's chat briefly about vicarious trauma. This describes the transformation of our view of the world due to a buildup of exposure to traumatic images and stories. Especially my nonprofit people or people who work with populations that are often oppressed or abused, this is common. And I also feel like this is common for people who have, over time, heard unexpected stories and never had the space to process and to breathe. And so let's look at, again, a couple quick examples of how does this look like. Withdrawal from colleagues. So your colleague is working on an emotionally intense project and asks for your help. You make up a list of reasons why you can't help and avoid conversations about the project for the next few weeks. If I can be real with you, I did this. I have a colleague who was working on a really traumatic and emotionally intense project, and she had been traveling to different parts of the world, talking to really oppressed populations. And she had asked me if I wanted to partner with her and to help her because she needed help. She was, for whatever reason, the only researcher working on this project. And I made up some excuse like, oh, I can't, I don't know, I just can't. I don't remember what it was, but I made up this excuse. And then it wasn't until a couple months later when I circled back to her. I was like, hey, remember when you asked me to help you? And I was like, nah. And she's like, yep, I do remember. I was like, okay. I was like, yeah. I was like, honestly, I just emotionally couldn't. And I should have just communicated that with you. I'm sorry. And being able to circle back and have that conversation with her. Another example is intrusive thoughts or images. So a troubling story a participant shared with you keeps popping into your head. And as you continue your study, you craft questions that would circumvent similar stories from other participants. And I understand why people do that. But at the same time, you are not allowing your participants to fully share their experience. And before I jump into the last mindset shift, I want to share one more thing that's related to this. Again, in this section, it says, counselors assist colleagues or supervisors in recognizing their own professional impairment and provide consultation and assistance when warranted with colleagues or supervisors showing signs of impairment and intervene as appropriate to prevent imminent harm to clients. What I love about this is the spirit of accountability. God, does our industry need more accountability? And I love this because it's an example of a community trying to care for each other and look out for each other. I mean, who do you have in your life that can put you in check when they're recognizing you're not doing your best work because something else is like happening? I remember, I've told a story about my mom before. If you know, like, she does not F around. And I remember when I was a kid, I was in maybe like 4th or 5th grade, and I wrote this paper. It was trash. My teacher didn't read it, and he gave me an A. And I remember going to my mom, being proud that I got this A, and my mom reads the paper, and she's like, He did not read this paper. So my mom calls the teacher. You're doing no favors for my daughter by not reading her paper and then giving her an A. Then she called the superintendent and complained. Then she made me rewrite the paper, and she graded it, and then I had to hand that graded paper to my teacher so he could learn or grow or whatever. Yeah. And do you have people like that, though? And she did it because she loved me. She's like, hey, my daughter is black in America. You are doing her absolutely no favors by not grading the quality of her work and helping her rise to it. Who do you have like that in your life? And finally, I'm going to briefly touch on this last mindset shift from focus on team and company to the individual. And again, when we often talk about what does it mean to be a researcher, why do we get into research, people often spew things that they're able to relate to. I'm able to talk to more people, I'm able to, and it's always about this relationship between them and something else, but what about the relationship between you and yourself? And at the core of this mindset is this question: what if our journey to become UX researchers began not with the urge to help people or save the world, but rather to save ourselves? I know. A part of me had to kind of fight this talk track that says, but this seems so selfish. And it kind of is, but that's okay. If you've ever flown before, at some point, the flight attendant gets on the intercom and says, place oxygen mask on yourself first before helping small children or others who may need your assistance. And for parents especially, this seems like against every instinct of what it means to be a parent. Take care of myself before my child? But the reason why they say that is because if your child falls unconscious, they're still breathing, you can still put that mask on them, but if you fall unconscious, your child is never going to get that oxygen or that person next to you. And I find this a really important analogy for people who are always remembering to care for other people, but always forget to care about themselves. But unless you prioritize self-care and do the necessary work to address any issues that may holistically be weighing you down and are possibly causing professional impairments, you will fizzle out and you will not help a single person. Yes, favorite part of the presentation. So earlier this year, the movie Us by Jordan Peele came out. Now, I'm not like into scary movies, I don't do like horror, but what I love about Jordan Peele's movies, and he also did the movie Get Out, is that there's so much meaning and metaphor and symbolism behind what he does. And I want to tie this back into us. What we bury deep and try not to face affects the world that we try to make around us. And essentially, I think what's getting here is, what mask do you wear to to work and why. Some of us wear masks to protect ourselves. Some put on fronts to hide insecurities, to mask things that have happened to us that we have yet to process and deal with. But what I love about, again, this movie, and even just the core message of it, it's about being careful to acknowledge the things that you're bringing into work because we're people. I don't know if you've ever experienced someone where they were just super duper arrogant, but the reason why was because they were so insecure, and what you probably didn't know about that is a lot of things happened to them growing up or during their college years that caused them to teach themselves how to put up this front. I think managers especially, this is really important. When you start to make that shift into a position of power, sometimes you can lose sight of how things that you are experiencing outside of your 9 to 5 or have experienced outside of your 9 to 5 affect your teammates. And so I want to be super careful not to usher many of us into this lingering of a potentially difficult and painful space. So I'll just wrap up this mindset by simply saying this, that for your colleagues' sake, for your participants' sake, but more importantly for your sake, for some of us, it's time to do that necessary work and address the things that we've tried to bury deep and not face. Essentially, it's time to start removing some of the masks that we wear. And so we have these 3 mindset shifts, but practically speaking, how can we begin to put some of these into practice? How can we truly learn from the human service industry that self-care is an ethical imperative, and self-care and ethics start with me? And how can we resist the siren call of self-neglect? And really at the core of this resistance is understanding that this isn't about checking off boxes. All right, I did Headspace or the Calm app, got 6 hours of sleep. They should at their core be life-giving. You often feel tired, not because you've done too much, but because you've done too little of what sparks a light in you. I think self-care at its very core essence is this. And so here's just some examples of what that looked like. If you can afford it, some of you need to go to therapy. It's time. And again, the tip I give people is if they're trying to feel out a therapist, I always, before I had the therapist I have now, I had this one therapist, and I remember just throwing her something small to see how she would handle it. And so I was like, yeah, I just moved back from being on the East Coast for 5 years to Chicago, and me and my best friend, we're trying to figure out what does it look like for us to live in the same geographical proximity. Just threw it out there, see what she said. She was like, yeah, sometimes it's really hard and you gotta grieve and move on from friendships, and it's hard to let them go. And I was like, I didn't say any of that. So I found a new therapist. But in all seriousness, therapy is a part of just caring about your mind and your spirit. It's about making sure that you're grounded in your center. If you can't afford therapy, even things like finding a core group of people who understand the experiences you've been to, whether it's from a workplace position or especially people who are underrepresented in the industry. Find somewhere where you can safely vent, be heard, and be understood without having to explain all the intricacies of your experience. A colleague of mine talked about the good no. Some of us take on more than we should because we have a really hard time saying no. And managers, you can do better at protecting the space around your researchers and making sure that you are assigning them things that do not cause them to compromise self-care for the sake of a product. People over product every day. Even things like boundaries. I personally my work phone is off on the weekend. I was telling my coworkers, you can text me all you want. I am not answering. But just, there's simple things like this. And There's so much more I want to pack into. I'm already over time, but I will not let this clock determine my life. So there's a lot more I want to share that I couldn't fit in this presentation. So what I have for you is a gift. I created this Google Drive that has a bunch of different folders in it. There are self-care assessments, there are resources in there. And I also just want to briefly talk about a folder I have in there called Dear White People. So let me just start by saying, for people of color, I want you to give yourself permission to not always feel like you need to talk to your well-meaning white peers about racism, systemic and institutionalized bias, like all of it. You have permission to not say shit about that because we are already dealing with emotional and mental burdens of being minorities and underrepresented in the workplace. You have that permission. Yeah, all like 3 people who snapped. But also, to my well-meaning white people, white men and women, I want you to understand how incredibly hard and difficult it is when you ask us questions that you could just Google. Yes. Yes. And I find one of the most probably difficult spaces to walk in is often I'll get someone come to me and they position themselves in this place of complete and absolute wokeness, and they're like, my other friend isn't as woke as I am. How can I help them become more woke like me? And I would like to say that if you are that person, you need to sit down because there is still plenty of work to do, and that's okay. It's okay. It's okay. But these resources that I have in the Dear White People folder are books, articles. If you don't feel like Googling, you can go here. There's also articles talking about how hard it is to be the only one in a workplace, to not see yourself reflected in your organization. What's a common thought as well is, man, like, how I do is not only going to impact me in this workplace, it's going to impact the black woman coming in after me. White men don't think about that. They're like, if I mess this up, I don't know if they're going to bring in any more white men. That's a thing. So I just wanted to briefly get into that folder. And again, I want to close by saying that this isn't easy stuff. Part of the reason why it's not easy is because we haven't been taught about this in school. We haven't been taught about this by our some UX leaders. But more importantly, it's difficult because it requires us to sit with ourselves. And that's just hard. But in the spirit of growing in our understanding of what does it mean to be human-centered and empathic, in the spirit of getting tired of frantically mopping and being willing to address the plug, remove it, turn off the faucet, and clean up the mess that often are birthed from things that we have yet to address, my hope for you today is that you would feel like you have a lens to identify areas that we need to work on, that you would feel encouraged and empowered to do so, and that you would feel like you can continue to address and resist the call of self-neglect. Thank you.